United States political system. We're going to talk a little bit about the Articles of Confederation, and then we're also going to talk about the U.S. Constitution. The Articles of Confederation came before the U.S. Constitution. Don't confuse this with the Confederates, like during the Civil War. This is the earlier Confederation. A confederation just means a grouping together of states. And in this case, this sort of confederation between the states that used to be the British colonies. And they basically were joined together in this sort of loose confederation to sort of fight off the British in trying to win their independence. And in order to do this, they wanted to settle some issues. So the Articles of Confederation really were mainly aimed at settling three main issues. One was basically raising an army. They needed to be able to create an army from amongst all of the states and basically command that army together. So it created that ability to raise and command an army from amongst all the states. They also needed to fund the war effort. So they needed to print and borrow money. So this idea of having a common currency and being able to print money amongst all the states and borrow money from other countries collectively, they set up the system by which they could do that under the Articles of Confederation as well. Also, they needed to resolve territorial disputes. Who was going to get different regions to the west, and where the borders going to fall between the states and that sort of thing. So they needed to resolve that amongst themselves, and that Articles of Confederation did that as well. So really, those are the three things that the Articles of Confederation did. The ability to print and borrow money, the ability to raise an army and command it, and the settling of territorial disputes. And that was basically it. It was a pretty limited document. And once they sort of got further into the Revolutionary War, and they started to see the value of a union between all the states, they started to look at the idea of having a stronger governing document that created a stronger union between the states. And that's when they drafted the Constitution. The Constitution, which basically established the U.S. government as it exists today, and basically has been amended throughout history to make different changes. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution really focus on protecting citizens' freedoms and rights under the law, and they call that first 10 amendments the Bill of Rights. For the exam, you want to be familiar with the basic system of the U.S. government and some terminology related to it. So let's talk a little bit about the U.S. government. There's basically three branches to the U.S. government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. The executive branch, or the legislative branch, I should say, is basically comprised of Congress. And the Congress is a bicameral legislature. So that's a good term to know for the test. Bicameral means having two houses, as opposed to unicameral, which would mean having only one house. Why is it that we had a bicameral legislature? The reason was because there was sort of a debate between the populous states and the less populous states. The populous states said, we need to basically do this based on population. And the smaller states, things like Rhode Island, said, no, we should just have a certain set number of representatives for each state. So each was arguing for what would be to their advantage. And the compromise was essentially they did both. In the House of Representatives, it's based on population, and in the Senate, it's based on just two representatives for each state. So you sort of had a compromise in creating this bicameral legislature that created our Congress. So that's the legislative branch. The executive branch is basically the president and his cabinet. And the judicial branch is essentially the Supreme Court and all the lower courts. The purpose of the legislative branch is to make the laws. And the purpose of the executive branch is to enforce the laws, whereas the purpose of the judicial branch is to interpret the laws. So in the legislature, a bill might get passed by both the House and the Senate and get passed to the president. If he signs it, it becomes law. But if he doesn't, he can basically stop it. And that power that he has is veto power. So if he vetoes that bill, it goes back. With only a simple majority, meaning just over 50%, they can pass the bill initially. But if he vetoes it, you have to have a 2/3 majority in order to override that president's veto. So he exerts a check against the legislature's power. And there's this system of checks and balances where each of these branches has a power over the other one so that none of them can become too strong. And this, so the founding fathers had this idea that they didn't want anybody to become too powerful. They didn't want the president to become like a king or something like that. So they built in these checks and balances. So the president's check is veto. The legislature has a check as well. If they feel that the executive is doing a terrible job or he's doing something awful, they can basically impeach him. So impeachment is a power that the legislature has over the executive, or a check that they have. The executive has a check over the judicial, and that's that he appoints the Supreme Court justices. So appointment is his power. But if the legislature doesn't like somebody that the president appoints to the Supreme Court, they can basically decline that nomination to the Supreme Court. So they have to ratify those appointments. So that's their check. The check that the judicial has over both the executive and the legislative is if the legislature passes a bill and the president signs it into law, the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, can look at that and say, you know what, we don't think that law is constitutional, and they throw it out. So they can throw out a law even if it's been passed and signed by both the legislature and the executive. The power to basically declare laws unconstitutional was sort of solidified and set up in a sort of very, very important Supreme Court decision, Marbury versus Madison. So for the exam, it's good to know Marbury versus Madison set up this power which we call judicial review. Judicial review is essentially the ability for the Supreme Court to declare a law unconstitutional. The United States political system. Political parties have existed since the very beginning, and there have been many, many different parties over time. Important ones to know for the test, that probably the two most important are the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were under Alexander Hamilton, the Anti-Federalists under Thomas Jefferson. The Federalists favored a strong federal government, a strong central government that would have a lot of power over the states, whereas the Anti-Federalists favored more states' rights and state power, so a much more limited federal government. Anti-Federalists tended to be Southerners, and they wanted to be able, one of the rights they wanted to have was the ability to make their own laws about slavery and not have the federal government impose anti-slavery legislation, perhaps. So this was one of the reasons that the South tended to be anti-Federalist, but there were other reasons as well. So the Anti-Federalists basically were looking for stronger states' rights, the Federalists looking for a stronger central federal government that had power over the states. These parties evolved over time into many different parties, and later we get the Democratic Party under Andrew Jackson, which was opposed at the time by the Whig Party. Over many, many iterations, eventually we get the Republican Party that exists today, but it's very, very hard to draw direct parallels in terms of ideology or political stance on different issues through these different parties because they've changed their policies and ideas so much over time, and this is true of nearly all of the different parties that have existed in the American political system over time.